how can we build something that will change people's lives and let community be part of it? I think that's what completely geeks me out. You know, here I was, 2 kids, 2 different dads. It was never the way, like literally, it was not the way my life was meant to be. The budget was almost 3 times more than what we had anticipated it would be. So it meant I had to continue progressing with the job, knowing that I was in minus 150K. This is the equivalent of being on a season of Survivor, but there's no camera crew to save you.
No prize money
for
at the
real,
end.
no prize money. I can't pay the rent. We can't live in this house. I have to go back to the UK. And it was worth the risk, because what I was going to get was going to be so much more if I did get it.
Welcome to Not the Rob Bell Podcast, where we talk with business owners, marketers, and professionals to extract what makes people and businesses successful.
Hey everyone, and thanks for tuning in to Not the Rob Bell Podcast. Today's guest, I've got Yemi Penn. She's a mechanical engineer and project manager working on some of the biggest infrastructure projects you've ever seen. We talk all things consulting, starting a business as a single parent, professional development, and so much more. It's coming up now. So Yemi Penn, thank you so much for coming to chat today.
My pleasure. Thank you for having me. Seriously, I'm honoured.
It's amazing to have you here. And you have quite an interesting story, and I don't really want to cover it myself because I think I wouldn't do it justice.
Right.
Can you give us, say, the pre-Australian history, or like pre-moving to Australia history of Yemi Penn?
Oh gosh, okay, let's see. I usually think I'm the queen of summaries, so let's see if I can do this. So noting that I relocated to Australia 6 years ago, prior to that, you know, my history was being born in the UK, but living a big part of my life in Nigeria, which is West Africa. So I have 6 siblings. And we spent a big chunk of our life there, getting to know the culture, being around a much wider family, until things started to get difficult in Nigeria. You know, you've got parts of the media that show, you know, the kind of negative side, but it has a lot of wealth. But then there was a period where it got really bad, and that was in the 90s. So in the 90s, myself and my siblings relocated back to the UK. My mum was a very smart woman, and every time she was pregnant, she would go to the UK and give birth to us. So we had that red passport, and I'm so grateful to her for that.
That's very smart.
And then I just continued as having to try to get used to being in one part of the world, which was in Africa, to then being in the UK was a bit of a shock, because I was trying to figure out, well, who am I? Where do I fit? And, you know, myself and siblings, we all responded differently, but just continued as is. I think it was until probably my early teenage years, I started to think, there's got to be a bit more. And I would read things like Rich Dad, Poor Dad. I don't know where it came from, but I had a thirst for just wanting to know more. And then I remember my dad was a lawyer, and there is something in the African culture that says one of his kids have to carry on in his business.
Interesting.
And it turns out that I was the kid that was chosen to carry that on. So I studied that at my A-levels, which I think is the equivalent of HSC here. And I enjoyed it, but I was bored. I was bored at the thought of arguing consistently, even though I enjoyed parts of it. And I think there was an incident where I think my mum had bought an IKEA table and no one had put it together in the house. And this is where my own unconscious bias is because I was sitting nicely waiting for my brothers to do it. And I put it together and my mind just went, what does this involve? What career is that? And it was engineering. And so I went on to study engineering. There were challenges, without a shadow of a doubt. And just the idea of being in a field where typically there were less women, and definitely women of colour, there was something in that I wanted to just prove. And so I studied engineering, worked in the automotive, chemical, and then rail industries. And then another itch came where I thought there has to be more to life than this. And that was when I had my daughter. So that was 13 years ago. And life would do its obligatory thing of throwing, some curveballs. And I became a single mum, then got married and relocated to Japan. So I lived in Okinawa for a little while.
Interesting.
And then it was at that point I probably had my version of a crisis, because that would have me go back to the UK and then relocate to Australia. And that's where I guess it brings me here now, because my story kind of changes dramatically over the past 4 years. But yeah, that's probably the best summary I could give.
That's pretty concise. And it does, so that gets us to Australia. But before we quite get there, how do you think the cumulative experience of Nigeria, UK, and Japanese culture has contributed to the way that you see the world now?
That's such a fascinating story. No one has ever asked me that. It's mulled around in my head that I've moved around a fair bit. I think what it's given me is it's allowed me to get rid of what I call blind spots, meaning that my version of reality isn't the only one. So I'll be honest with you, I definitely have always carried more bias than I do today. And I think that's because of my personal development. So living in Nigeria, when I was younger, we didn't really want for anything. My dad was doing quite well until things got really bad in the 90s. So for me, and also remember that I was a majority. I don't like the fact that we still have to talk about separation of gender and, race and religion, but but I didn't know anything else.
Sure.
And then I moved to the UK and I become a stark minority, and there's some slight differences in how I'm responding to people or vice versa. And then Japan was almost like, I don't know if I'm using the right word, utopia. It felt like a completely different world. I was married to a US military veteran. And so it was a very different world I was in. So that was actually opening what other things happen in the world that were outside of what I thought life was. I've written my book, Did You Get The Memo?, which is about how life is meant to be lived. And going to Japan really opened a whole different world to me. And so I guess my interest for living in a different part of the world grew. And then I moved to Australia, and it was like going back to the UK, but even maybe a couple of decades later, because I was then another stark minority. On top of that, there was no family. I was on my own. So that required my biggest piece of growth. It was the fact that I needed to decide after a year of being in Australia, okay, so what are you going to do, Yemi? There's something that's not working in the UK, something didn't work in, Japan, and I don't want to go back to Nigeria or Africa just yet. What can you do to make it work? And I made a shift, I think about 18 months in. Honestly, the best thing I've ever done. Like literally, I'd have to say Australia has given me new life. I call it being born again in the non-biblical sense.
That's amazing.
Yeah.
That's really amazing. And so we will talk about your book in a little bit as well. But I understand that you've worked on some really amazing engineering projects, and you touched that you got your Bachelor or Masters of Engineering?
Bachelors
of Engineering. And so when you came to Australia, did you have something lined up to fall straight into?
Yes, I did. So I've been really blessed and fortunate because I was in Japan, then I went back to the UK for a short stint, and I think the infrastructure industry started to boom again, and it probably has been for the past couple of years. And so thankfully with my degree, I was able to be sponsored over through a consultancy and was going to do a lot of work in the transport infrastructure. So it was under the mechanical engineering, guise that I came through, and then just started working on managing mainly rail projects because I'm a bit of a rail nerd. I love the railway. And so, yeah, that was my entry into Australia.
And I mean, you were working, at least for part of that period that we're talking about, for Transport for New South Wales.
Correct,
on some of the biggest infrastructure projects that probably anyone in New South Wales and no doubt most people in Australia have heard of.
Yeah.
What was it like being involved in some of these projects which have such a lasting impact on our culture?
I think this is where I completely geek out as a nerd. So for me, it's phenomenal. I mean, I can't figure out whether I just like the new shiny projects, because I worked on Crossrail in the UK and a little bit of high speed rail, which were really big projects in terms of changing how we commute. And then working on some of the projects that I still currently am in New South Wales, I think sometimes I need to pinch myself, because to be part of something that people will talk about in a century, similar to the Harbour Bridge or the Opera House, it's huge. And most of the time we're building railway in an already existing community. And to how we do it is where I get really interested. How can we build something that will change people's lives and let community be part of it? I think that's what completely geeks me out. And then the technology. I mean, we've got some of the most brilliant minds from all over the world who have come together to say, okay, how can we use technology to get us to places potentially faster and safer and having significantly less damage on, our ecosystem. So it's probably, without realizing it, probably something I may have put on a bucket list at some point. But yeah.
That's cool.
Yeah.
And you're right. We talk about it for so long, and even some of my family have stories around building the Harbour Bridge and that sort of thing. And you almost forget now that real people put their real hands on the formwork to make that happen.
Exactly. I mean, look, sometime, where was I? I was in Italy or Egypt. And I remember thinking there is no way humans did this. They must have had aliens or little, I don't know, magpies or something. But you're right. We forget people were here before us doing the work. And, it's a process. You've got, the engineers, designers, planners, architects, and then you've also got the workforce who are building the design. Just the whole supply chain, it boggles my mind. And I'm not sure whether we as humans actually stop and celebrate how amazing we all are in actually making things happen.
Probably not regularly enough.
Yeah, we should, because we'd probably do a lot more than we already are.
Absolutely. And so some of these really gargantuan projects with billions, hundreds of billions of dollars in spend take quite an extraordinary amount of project management. I know you have a master's in project management. How does the interplay between the engineering side and the project management give you a leg up in this kind of world?
I love your questions. Oh my gosh, I love it. Like, seriously. So I studied mechanical engineering and I did a master's in project and enterprise, which is around the construction. And I always say theory is very different to reality. And even though my degrees prepared me for this, but when you're in the real world and you add elements of human intelligence, emotional intelligence, it's a completely different ballgame. So I read the book by Yuval Harari, who wrote Homo Sapiens, and he had this statement that has stuck with me forever, which is we do not want to be in a situation where we have downgraded humans controlling upgraded technology. And so for me, the difference between engineering and project management is that engineering is the individual who gets into the detail of how to design, build something. This is in the space of infrastructure. And then for me, the project manager is the person who's working with that, intelligence, that IQ, but they are bringing EQ, emotional intelligence, to say, we see you, we love this wonderful thing. How can we build this so that it actually serves the purpose for humanity? And I'm not suggesting engineers don't have that, but it's a different part of the brain you use. The work I've done over the past 4-6 years has been, how can I use the other part of my dormant brain that wasn't engineering to actually make things happen? Because, I'm sure, New South Wales isn't short of that. We've got projects that were planned to be built, decades ago, and it just got stopped. How can we get smarter about choosing what we want to build and finding really efficient ways to build it? And that's what, for me, project management does. So being able to cross both boundaries has fulfilled me, because a lot of people are in careers sometimes that is not fulfilling, but I had to drive that. You go and you have your development plan conversation with a manager, and most of the time it's your manager driving it. I really wanted to change that, because I knew they'd get the best out of me if I could fuse both project management and my engineering together.
Sure. And so you've sort of fast forwarded a little bit there in terms of the work you're doing more recently, so the last 4 to 6 years. And I know you do some coaching and consulting around emotional intelligence and self-awareness and that sort of thing. Is that sort of a third dimension to those 2 degrees that you've got?
I think it is. It's, my mum used to say, Yemi, you can't be a master. Was it master of all trade or something? Basically the thing where you become a
jack of all trades, master of none.
There you go. I managed to delete it from my brain. I don't even know what it means
Something
anymore.
more important in there.
Yes. But I guess what she was saying is you have to focus on one thing. And these are kind of the myths that I'm trying to debunk, because, the world has suggested there's a spectrum, and they've decided that normal is within some of the boundaries. And if that's the case, I'm definitely sitting outside of the boundaries, because I need lots of things to stimulate my mind. And sometimes I work better. So I start to think, well, Yemi, are these 2 different things? You've got the engineering, like, where's this coaching coming from? And what I found is that when I was managing projects, I tended to get really good feedback because I was very clear and I couldn't pick it up. Was it my technical ability, or was it actually my ability to form relationships? Was it my ability to communicate clearly? Was it my ability to note when I had messed up and apologize? So it was the human elements coupled with my engineering that got me to have successful outcomes. And I found myself getting really frustrated when I'd be working projects, and someone was trying to say something in a room with a senior executive, but they were too scared to say it. So for me, I started to focus, well, if we could work on the human element, we might actually get superior outcomes with engineering and infrastructure. So for me, I see it fusing really well. I mean, I've recently worked on kind of rebranding my message because some people get confused as to, well, do they work? And, come up with this philosophy of engineering powerful people. And so I think it works really well. But in all honesty, in every industry, unless we are all going to put our hands up and say artificial intelligence is going to drive humanity from here on in, we need to up-level ourselves. And I think that's all about EQ.
And I mean, we talk about artificial intelligence, and at the moment, yes, it's taking off, but it's still humans driving it first. And so it's really going to go where we desire it goes.
Absolutely.
And so we fast forward a little bit. Obviously, you started off Penny Consulting.
Yes.
And what was the pinnacle moment in that journey? No doubt you thought about it for a period of time. What was that right, I'm going to do this now?
It's probably threefold, but I might only share two of them. The first one was I was working in a consultancy that somebody else ran, and I was happy. I think I'd done a bit of development. I'd managed to get my salary up about 40%. So I was like, yeah, you're doing good. Until I found that I was working on a project that was no longer exciting me. I wasn't, I spend more than 70% of my waking hours. I like what I'm working on to fulfill me. And I had asked to be put on a specific project, a project that I knew I could add value and I just wanted to be part of. And I'd heard through the grapevine that the directors had decided not to put me on that project, even though there was every possibility, because they needed me to be in another part of the business to make sure that their consultancy grew. And I have no qualms about that. The only issue I had is that they didn't consult me in that conversation.
Sure.
And freedom is one of my biggest values for very many obvious reasons. I like to have the choice. And I found that I couldn't in that. And so I started to have this crazy idea of, well, what if I could choose my own projects? And I started to speak to people. And in order to really have that, really 90% freedom, I would need to go out on my own. And that was nuts, because here I was, single parent in tens of thousands of debt. On paper, it made no sense. And as I look back at my history, a lot of things don't make sense on paper, but I was more focused on what that outcome was. And then I found out, how do I set up a company? Do I even have the right visa requirements? Does the client even know me, or is it the company they know? And I went through all of that, but it was purely because I wanted the freedom to choose. I mean, if you are not enjoying what you're doing, it is a shame. And I know sometimes we need to make it work because we've got responsibilities. Then it's really difficult to understand why you'd wake up in the morning and go. And so for me, that was my push to okay, take the risk, jump, set up your own consultancy. And look, there were a number of steps in there, but fundamentally I did that because, I wanted choice.
And you just mentioned something very interesting around the balance of responsibilities. And obviously you were a single mum at the time. How do you analyse that balance without striking too much of your own bias into what's required and what's desired?
Another great question. I mean, this is where I then go into more of my transformation space, and I wouldn't have noticed it at the time. But for me, it's about, I had to relax my rules. I had to relax the rules I placed around myself, because the rules suggest you need to be in a 2-parent home to be able to have access to give the responsibility. I mean, back in the day, I think it was, it was the man that was the main breadwinner and the woman would stay at home. So I'd already kind of changed that, not necessarily by choice, my circumstances. So that rule had already been broken just by circumstance. And so for me, I had to rebalance it and say, well, what do I want? Do I want to be able to afford to take my kids on holiday or to pay for this school trip? And I started to do the math, and I'd even need to keep asking for more and more salary and just moving jobs, even if it doesn't fulfill me. So for me, I had to go through, it was almost like an internal audit of what it was I wanted. And so that was the balance. But I'll be honest with you, there was risk. And, I talk about it, I think, in a different name in my book of, well, what does risk mean? For me, I had to go to the extreme. Risk means I can't pay the rent. We can't live in this house. I have to go back to the UK. And it was worth the risk, because what I was going to get was going to be so much more if I did get it. So I had to have that internal conversation, but that was the whole balancing act. And look, I relied on a few coaches here and there and people who I guess had done it. I think that's the other thing. People forget that people have been here before us and done the very things we want to do. And for me, I have no problem asking.
And I think that's a really valuable asset as well, when you can recognise what you don't know.
Correct.
And obviously going from working in a consultancy to having your own consultancy, there's a lot of unexpected aspects that come along that you hadn't even thought of. Is there some of those that stand out for you?
Yeah. Oh, accounting. I mean, I'm an engineer, but for some reason, me and numbers just don't get on. And I think
numbers and accounting are a different side.
They are different, and they don't teach you this in school. No. And I wish somebody would. So I'm here, like, even today thinking, damn, Yemi, why don't you get this? So accounting was one. You know, I think when you work for someone else or as an employee, there's very little you get to see as to what happens with all the numbers. That was the big thing for me. I mean, even today, I've just swapped and changed accountants because I actually now need to learn. You know, I'm wanting to build other business ventures. And at some point, if I have a couple of companies and I don't know how the numbers are being worked, then I think more for me. So I need to get comfortable with it. So accounting was definitely one. I'll be honest, there's one which is actually a good thing, is I didn't realize how much being your own champion and being comfortable with the service you offer is actually a really good thing. That is a reason why you could partner up with people or start your own thing. So for me, the biggest opening was, well, I don't think they're teaching this in school. I don't think they're teaching the idea of either working for yourself or partnering or having a side hustle or side project, because it actually appeared to be easier than I thought. Mentally, emotionally, I've had to do the work to just change the rules and the story I tell myself. But in reality, it's not as hard as I thought it was going to be.
Interesting.
Oh, no. Big words. I've never said that out loud. Might need to cut that bit out, but yeah. But I do believe it's not as hard as I thought it was going to be.
And when we think about learning new skills, such as accounting, coming as a bit of a shock, how do you sort of navigate learning enough around those types of things and not becoming your own bookkeeper when you shouldn't?
Oh, mate, I am not interested in becoming my own bookkeeper. I think it's finding the balance. You know, I do a lot of personal development work with Tony Robbins in particular, a number of other personal development people. And I did a program, I think it was a business mastery course last year in Vegas. And there was this really great guy. He had us chant, I love numbers and numbers love me. And he gave the explanation of, say, someone who's doing the scoring of cricket and he has all these numbers, like he has to understand the game. He doesn't need to be the player, but he needs to understand it to a level that he knows the numbers he needs to put on the board for the rest of people. And that stuck with me, is that I don't need to be an expert here. I'd like to trust the person I bring on board and for them to hear what my dreams are to grow my business and for them to explain the numbers. So I think for me, the balance is, what am I trying to do here? Where can I reserve that energy? I don't have a love for accounting. I have a love for creating platforms and guiding people to figure out their potential and solving problems. So that's where I need my energy to go. So I balance it by figuring out, well, what am I trying to achieve? And at the moment, it's not to do accounting. So just the basics.
And I do know that you did a business mastery with Tony Robbins, because you mentioned it in a podcast episode, which I've stalked, no doubt. And we will briefly mention your podcast, Did You Get The Memo?
Yes.
Because I didn't.
You said it.
Love it. We're allowed to say it. We might beep it. We'll see how we go. But the reason this stood out for me is someone from the outside looking in would see you as exceptionally successful, very, very focused on your goals. How important does that professional development role play in the continued evolution of Yemi Penn?
I think it's pivotal. Every now and again, people look at me because there's usually another course or I've seen something. You know, I'm currently considering doing a PhD, which is a whole different conversation.
Absolutely.
And people just, they're wondering why. But I think it's because I'm trying to validate my purpose on this earth in the least pressuring way. I want to feel excited every morning. I mean, just driving here, you should have seen me singing my head off in the car. Like, I'm excited. This is the kind of stuff I want to do, which is to talk about the things that I guess not everyone gets to talk about or other people get to listen to. So for me, personal development is about growth, because if we're not growing, we're dying. And it gives a different dimension. I'm not comfortable with this memo that we've been kind of told is the only way to live. I think for some people it would work. For me, it didn't. And so for me, doing personal development is key, just because reality is not known by anybody. And so I want to make sure that I can find out as many different realities. And that involves speaking to different people, traveling to different parts of the world, learning a different theory from different thought leaders. It's something I'll be doing, I think, until my last breath.
That's very cool.
Yeah.
And I know you talk a lot in what I understand around what you train and how you educate other people is around removing the blind spots. And you mentioned this before. Is that part of that process with engaging people like Tony Robbins in order to sort of find those because we can't see them?
Yeah, I mean, look, the blind spot thing has actually been my own thing. It means, for instance, that if there is someone who's different to me, I lean into their story. I lean into the way they do things. I don't need to agree. So this came about, I think I did some work with UTS and I was putting together, it was a goal setting webinar I was putting together, and I did some research on liminal thinking. And liminal means at the boundaries of threshold. Is literally the point between what you're comfortable with and what's different. And what people don't realize is that that different is usually something that can make you successful, either materialistically or just personally. And for me, it was, I think I've just gone blank on what your original question was.
Blind spots and Tony Robbins. Yep.
Yes. Okay. So for me, reading that on liminal thinking it gave the story of the elephant and 6 blind men. Have you heard that story?
No.
Yes. Okay. Literally two minutes will go through. Apparently there's this king and he's got an elephant and he calls for 6 blind men to go and, figure out what this is. Can they figure out it's an elephant? One of the blind men's touching the foot of the elephant. It says this is a tree trunk. The other person's touching the tail. It says this is a rope. Someone's touching the tusk. It's saying this is like a knife, a really long knife. Someone the ear and says, oh, this is a really big fan. And they all swear blind, excuse the pun, but I do this every time. They all literally swear blind that what they are touching is what this is, to the point that they would start hurting each other. And that story for me was so powerful because in their mind, that is it. But there's only really one person that had the whole view, or unless they moved further along the elephant, they'd find out there was a little bit more. And so it was from liminal thinking that I started to think, wow, just that simple story, there could be other things. And if I can get off my belief system, I might find something else out. And so that's probably been the biggest shift for me.
I don't want to derail where that story goes, but I have an interesting comparison.
Please.
I'm really personally interested in machine learning and artificial intelligence and developing systems for those. And one of the interesting challenges that we have when we develop machine learning algorithms is that if you train a computer to look between or to classify an apple versus an orange, if you then show it a banana, it has no idea what that is. And that's the gap between machine learning and artificial intelligence is trained learning versus unsupervised learning.
Wow.
And it's one of those big chasms of engineering challenges when it comes to artificial intelligence.
I'm intrigued. I didn't even know you were going to be all over artificial intelligence.
And I don't want to stay there either. That's not the point. It's not the Rob Bell podcast after all. So let's get back on track. So you started Penny Consulting in 2016, and then in 2017 you started W Squared Coaching.
Yeah. Can
you give us a bit of a rundown of the differences and how that all came about?
I noticed Tony's getting a lot of airplay here. So I was at a Tony Robbins event, and look, I'm part of his platinum group, and so they usually say surround yourself by the tribe in which you want to grow into. So it was my first ever event because I'd been very resistant to this guy. He was just too tall and too American. And I went in there reluctantly, and there was something that happened. I got asked a question and I got really emotional. And the question was, what do I stand to lose if I do not go into my full potential? So I was enjoying everything Penny Consulting. It was giving me more money than I ever thought I could ever bring in. And not that I wasn't satisfied, but I was still searching for more. And that's what personal development is how can I grow? But something still didn't feel right. And I think it was around relationships at the time. And so I went to this. And when I got asked that question, I got really emotional because there's been a part of me that's wanted to talk about my personal life experiences, but for one reason or another, I didn't feel it was safe to do that. And so there was something about using my voice, but something kept on saying, well, who are you? Who am I to be daydreaming? Like literally, you know, my ego and this other voice was telling me I don't even qualify for that. But when I got asked that question at the Tony Robbins event, I got really emotional because the images of Martin Luther King and Rosa Parks came into my mind. And I know that people, you know, we talk about this, but this was really real for me. If they didn't do the work they did, I couldn't have even dared try to do a mechanical engineering degree.
Sure, yeah.
And so my thought was, well, why do I get to sit on the sidelines and wait for somebody else to solve things? And that was when I decided, okay. And, you know, W squared, there was an undertone of wanting to work with women, but being in engineering, I have the masculine and feminine energy in abundance. And so I decided, okay, I was going to set it up, and then I procrastinated for a year. But that was the intent. It was to at least to start using my voice, because I guess I just had this weird feeling that if I did, it might give other people permission to do the same in a constructive way, because I think there's a way in how you do it.
Of course. And so is W squared almost like the personal prequel version of, you know, these really huge projects that you're working on through the consulting business?
No, I think it's the fusion of them together. And it's only recently because there was still some limiting beliefs I had. I still was having the imposter syndrome.
Yeah.
Because in reality, W squared really could have just been Yemi Penn, which is who I am. But it's effectively, you know, fusing the emotion intelligence to the penny consulting. So I actually still do work with the same transport, you know, organization when it comes to, say, organizational change, cultural, unconscious bias. So that's what W squared coaching does. But I guess I'd managed to tell myself the story that it needed to be separate from, say, penny consulting, because we go in there and we manage projects, but we manage it in a way that has all the values of W squared coaching underpinned.
Of course. That's very interesting. And so obviously in 2018, you also started an F45 in Brixton, UK.
Yes.
Can you tell us a bit about that? Must have come about from somewhere.
It did. When did it come back? I was at university in the UK, and I used to carry a lot more weight. I usually tell people, you know, we're a big bone family, nothing wrong with that. But I carried more weight than I needed to. And then I remember going to an aerobics class, and it was this guy from Jamaica. He'd have people with horns. It was like a carnival, but you were working out. And I'm like, what? You can have that much fun and work out. And I decided I wanted to become an aerobics instructor, because I wanted to be the big boned woman girl who would stand in front and teach. And so I started teaching aerobics at university, started doing it to Afrobics, which is Afro beats. And I remember them making the dream, I want to open a gym. And then I had my daughter and struggled to find a gym with a creche. And then my dream got bigger, but I was serious, but I couldn't see how that would happen. Then 6 years ago, I relocated to Australia, and I just see this building at F45. And I don't know whether it's the colors, maybe some psychologists got involved. And they did, right? I went in, and it didn't have any mirrors. It didn't have much equipment. And then the music, because I'm governed by music. If you start playing music here, my right shoulder starts twitching. It's just in me. And I just loved everything. I loved it. For me, it was technology meets community. It was the TV screens, and it was the community. They did this American thing of just high-fiving at the end, which really you're thinking, it's a bit lame, but you're secretly thinking, yes, please high-five me because I want you to see me. And I loved it. And I wanted to open one. I found out it was a franchise. I wanted to open one in Australia, but the territories that were left, I had no idea where they were. And so I figured, why don't I take one back to my hometown on a different continent? And by then I'd started my personal development, because on paper it's nuts. You live in Sydney, Yemi. Why are you trying to open one in London? But that was where I said, okay, well, why don't you use yourself as the guinea pig and see if you truly can bend reality in your mind to open one remotely. And if you do, then you can go talk to other people. That's what I told myself. And look, it took 2 years, 1 year of self-doubt, imposter syndrome, and another year of just sheer grit of like, I want to do this.
And no doubt there were some real challenges in starting up a new company in a continent that you weren't living in. What were some of those expected and unexpected challenges?
I guess the unexpected was how much money it was going to cost to actually build, like to do the build of the shell of where the studio was, compared to Australia. You know, you never know how painful it is when the Australian dollar and pound don't match each other.
Sure.
I just wish the world would just have everybody at the same rate. So that was unexpected because it was almost 3 times more. And I think it was a different kind of business to Penny Consulting. Penny Consulting didn't have the original overhead, but here I am in minus hundreds of thousands and hoping that it can make money, because that really is for me what part of entrepreneurship is hoping that what you want to get at will happen. And I guess once again, the unexpected was that people were craving this. People were craving an environment where they had a community. What was it someone said to me? F45, in my opinion, is not actually in the business of fitness. It's in the business of relationships.
Absolutely.
It's in the business of seeing people. And yes, along the way, there's physical progress. But more than anything, I think I received an email 3 months in of someone thanking me for opening it because she's no longer on her antidepressants and is just getting that, that zest for life in these words. So I think I didn't realize that. And that's why I truly believe that most of our dreams, when we have a dream about doing something, it actually chooses us. We think we go out there and it's now left to us to figure out if we're going to make it happen. I mean, look, that was the biggest thing, but I was also surprised that I did it. I'm going to be real. I remember thinking there's no way I'm going to open these doors, and self-sabotage tried to get in the way, but it opened. And I think it's just that we can literally do anything we put our mind to. And so, to be honest, a lot of good things, but also a lot of challenges.
And with that procrastination side of any big task like that, was there anything that you thought in your mind was a really huge hurdle but actually turned out to be, much simpler when you actually executed?
Yeah, I feel like you're reading my mind. If I put this out on the World Wide Web somewhere, the biggest one for me, and I think it's the first time I'm going to share it because I want to do it with as much respect as possible, that the budget was almost 3 times more than what we had anticipated it would be. And I was contemplating having an investor, but it was getting too difficult and it was distracting me. So I had this gap of about the equivalent of 150,000. And here I was thinking, I've spent so many hundreds of thousands and you're telling me I'm not going to be able to open because of that. So it meant I had to continue progressing with the job, knowing that I was in minus 150K. And I remember working with a coach and we did some emotional freedom technique, which is about tapping away some of the nervousness and anxiety. And literally I was riddled with anxiety, fear. I think I started to get stomach ulcers because I just had assumed the worst, that I wouldn't be able to open up and it'd be a loss and everyone would think I was foolish. And out of nowhere, whether it was meditation or the conversation, I actually thought, well, hold up, Yemi, you can actually get the money to pay. It's just it's going to take longer. And all I needed to do was have a conversation with the builder and say, can I do this on a payment plan? And I'm sure not everybody wants to run business like that. But the truth of the matter is, I just needed to have a conversation and be really honest with him. But when I compare the fear that was literally crippling me compared to the actual reality and the fact that there's actually kindness in humans, it honestly blew my mind that I literally was about to fold up the whole business without even having a conversation. And that for me still lingers in my mind. I always have respect for that man because he was so kind, but it also just makes me think all I needed to do was ask and be honest.
And I think there's a really interesting observation there in how transparency and accountability can really enable just about anything if we sort of take that leap. Is there any other moments like that help back up that thought pattern over your career?
Yeah. Oh, look, I think there is, sometimes to a fault. And I think this is where I start to talk about masculine and feminine energy. Because if the world really has been built predominantly to begin with the male energy and the input, which I will forever be grateful for, I will always represent men and women. I think there's more of a dominant energy that's used. And I found that when I don't go in bullish to either meetings or to request something from a client, I find that the output is a lot better for me. So I think my masculine energy allowed me to set up businesses because it was almost the fearless kind. So there's benefit in all of it. Oh. I was a bit fearless, and so I did it. There was still fear, but more fearless than I'd ever been. And then where I've had to use a lot of feminine energy is around the emotion and actually saying, well, how can we both win? And for us to both win, it means I have to be open and vulnerable about my challenges and my fears, but also actually do it with confidence. And that has worked really well for, say, winning new contracts with either private or government clients, is explaining to them, you don't need me on this job 5 days a week. Part of the benefit is that I get to do wonderful things like this, and say, how about we focus on the output? So, there are some businesses that want to work on the model of, no, let's go in there and let's bill for the 5 days. And I'm saying, I can get you the output, because for me, freedom's more important. And I actually tell them that. And when I bring them on the journey, I think they lean in a lot more. And as a result, there's trust and repeat business. So definitely it's worth for me being transparent.
And so we've touched on it a few times today with masculine and feminine energy, and I know that's a very strong Tony Robbins concept. Which
have you been following him?
A little bit, I must have been, and I have done a UPW experience as well.
Wonderful.
Probably a conversation for another time. Yep. But when it comes to engineering and getting women and girls into engineering and those very traditionally male-dominated fields, we've obviously seen some inroads over the last few years, certainly, but can we be doing more to encourage women to take up these aspects of work?
I think first we have to acknowledge the great work we're doing. I mean, just you saying that, and I know you have done work in the STEM space, we need to keep doing what we're doing. But it's funny because as you were talking, I've done quite a bit of work with universities, but for girls in, say, year 9, 10 and 11. And what I found is that the feedback I got is that they connected with me because of the real story behind it. I think sometimes we're trying to sell it like we're just trying to sell a product, as opposed to attaching a bit of emotion to it. So I think how we try to engage them becomes important. My daughter uses language like, she's 13 and says, I'm not good at math. And I remember it was a gentleman, he worked in Anstow, Sean, I can't remember his last name. And he said what we need to work with is trying to guide them and changing the language. It's not that you don't like math, it might just be you need a bit more guidance. So, and this is where, the whole W² coaching comes in, is how we talk, the language we use could actually be the big change. And so the story I use a lot is, if we don't have a diverse field, and diverse is culture, gender, orientation, then it just means whatever's being built, artificial intelligence, for instance, I want all of that that's being developed to be by a diverse group so that it serves the diverse world in which we live in. I think another thing that should be done is we need to start earlier. I look at my son who's 6 years old and I can already see bias in his language. Now, I know for a fact that's not coming from me. I think it's coming from what he watches on television.
Sure. And
I know television is changing a lot of what it is, but maybe if we had more input into what's being shown and the programs that are coming on to really show this, I think we'd start to see a shift in their mind from the beginning, that you can be anything regardless of your gender, your race, your culture. How we, the public, the people, influence what's on TV is a different question. But I think that goes into their mind. And even though the schools are doing a lot of things, there's still work to be done, but from a young age. Because what did they say? Up until the age of 7, that's when you can really start to mold how someone thinks. Anything past 7, you're almost trying to rebirth someone's mind.
Yeah, of course. And although we do still have this opportunity through till, say, mid-20s when that maturity really sets in.
Correct.
And so it's never too late.
True. I like that positivity. Yes.
Good. It's good. So we're coming up on time, actually, but I would love to have a quick chat about your book that you've put out. Did you get the memo? Because I fucking didn't. How did that come about on the journey?
I remember because I went to boarding school in Nigeria. And when I tell people that, I have to make it very clear that it's not like this is Prince Charles or Prince William who have gone to boarding school, because people usually associate boarding school with nice and fancy. Sure. This is the equivalent of being on a season of Survivor, but there's no camera crew to save you.
No prize money.
For real, no prize money. Prize money is survival. And I would come, having relocated to the UK, I'd come and I'd had a really good friend, Alex, and I would share stories with her. And she'd be laughing her head off and say, Yemi, you've got to write a book. I'd brush it off. But that's the power in words. She said that, and that stayed with me until I moved here to Australia, and I realized I want to write something that my kids can look back on in case for some reason I never get to the point of explaining all the things. Because I think the more we share, the more people are armed with making their own decisions. So that was the real catalyst for wanting to write, because I wanted them to hear the story. And then the next was when I had a coaching session, and I was asking her, because I was trying to convince myself that I hadn't truly screwed up in life. You know, here I was, 2 kids, 2 different dads. It was never the way, like literally it was not the way my life was meant to be. And so I was checking in with her saying, did you get the memo? Because I didn't get the memo because I'm screwed. And that was it. And then the rest of the journey was write the book. And look, I want to mimic almost what Jack Canfield did with his books of Chicken Soup for the Soul, which is short stories. And so the dream is to create a platform that other people can tell their stories, because then other generations can maybe read, and it's short point. And then, but we leave, I guess, juicy guidelines for people to create their own memo, because that ultimately is where I'm trying to get to. How can we create our own memo? Yes, within the confines of society, but I believe we can create our own.
And it's interesting. I know a little bit about Chicken Soup for the Soul as a book as well, and more about their journey in trying to. It's more of a journey of persistence, and I think most people don't realise it, whether they've read it or not, that they were turned away. And I'm going to mess this up, but it was either hundreds or thousands of publishers.
Thousands. And
then it turned in. It's been printed and released. Over 1 billion copies have sold, and like this is just insane.
It is. It's funny because I'm actually going to be interviewed by Jack Canfield later on this year, hopefully when everything is taken off.
Amazing.
And I mean, he shares that story, but that's the story he's been telling for decades now, because I think it still surprises him of the tenacity him and his team had, and the amazing success, but also the hunger that the world needed. So I'm very impressed, about that. Good work.
And obviously you have that persistence and that drive as well. How do you sort of keep that energy going?
I think it's the personal development. I change the tribe in which I surround myself with. Sometimes I'm being really stretched and I figure out if it's in my comfort zone. So that's it. But then I'm also listening to, I guess, the voice. So I think if an idea comes up in your mind, even if it's, I can't do that, I'd say investigate it. That's what is, to me, my mum said life was about, struggling and persevering. And I don't necessarily agree with that, but I think that is part of journey. It's actually being uncomfortable. The minute you find yourself uncomfortable, question, is it a bit stagnant? Is there something else? Can I do a course? Can I read a different book? So for me, I listen to the natural signs that are being sent to me, and most of it is restlessness. But I have to be careful because sometimes I can do too many things and then just burn out. So it's finding the balance. But I listen to every itch that I have, and I just make sure I ask myself, is it going towards that goal, that purpose? And if it's not, I let it go. And if it is, I'm like the Tasmanian Devil, I'm off.
And do you think everyone has their own balance of where that does land? Obviously, running 3 companies, putting out a book, running a podcast, doing keynotes, all that sort of thing at once. Does everyone have to find their own comfort level?
Oh, they do. What do I say? If I'm going to fuck up in life, it has to be on my own terms. There's nothing more criminal. And I know, sadly, our kids have to listen to parents because we're trying to save them, but we also need to give them the bandwidth to figure out what their own lane is. People need to create their own. And that's why I'm so dedicated to people creating their own memo, because we're all here for a different mission. And this is where I get into, what I call the woo-woo space or spiritual. We are all here for our own mission. And that's why we have, yes, go and get guidance, but eventually you will know what sits well with you. I think sometimes you just know. If you can get rid of that negative voice, you just know. But ultimately, everybody's here for if you weren't doing the work you're doing, I don't get the opportunity to have this amazing conversation. So I then champion you to do your dreams, because selfishly, it also serves me. So everyone needs to follow their own lane.
And likewise, if people like you aren't doing what you do, then I've got nobody to talk to.
Oh, I love it. Win-win.
So we are running out of time, but I've got a few quick questions that I'd love to ask. Mm-hmm. If you had to surmise all of your experience and impart one piece of wisdom on our listeners, what would that be?
Be fearlessly authentic.
Fearlessly authentic.
Yeah, meaning that just be yourself, but, do it anyway.
Amazing. And if you had to think retrospectively about maybe a misstep that you made and something that you learned that was exceptionally valuable, what would that be?
probably be the tens of thousands I lost trying to buy an investment property. And the lesson I learned there is just because my personal financial circumstances have changed, I still needed to change my money story. So remember, we stay the people we are. So if you're a nice person before you had money, you're still going to be nice. If you're a horrible person, you're still going to be horrible. My money story was still one of lack, one of not having. And as a result, I made mistakes and sometimes still do. So I now work on the mindset I have around money.
Interesting. And if there was one person in the world that you haven't had a chance to sit down and have lunch with, who would they be and what would you ask them?
Gosh, I'm going to be so cliche when I say this. But honestly, it would be Beyonce Knowles. Watching her story from the age of 15 to where she is, her dad was a manager. We hear she fired her dad, did her own thing, didn't tell the media she was going to release an album, and then did. Like, chick, what did you do? Can I have some of that? So it's not just about her music, it's actually her as a businesswoman.
And I think it's an underappreciated aspect of that industry.
Absolutely.
Is the business side.
Yeah.
There's certainly a lot of things we can learn.
Yeah.
So Yemi Penn, thank you so much for your time. Where can people find out more about you and maybe grab a copy of your book as well?
Absolutely. So thank you very much for having me. Honestly, I've loved every part of this. My website is easy. It's yemipenn.com. So that's YEMIPENN.com. And my book is on Amazon. I think most of the Booktopia. It will be in bookstores soon, but currently everything is online. You can get it on Kindle. But I'd love to connect and see if this actually resonated with anyone.
Absolutely. And the title again, Did You Get The Memo? Because I didn't.
You said that so many times. I love it.
It's amazing. Yemi Penn, thank you so much for your time. It's been amazing.
Thank you.
There you have it. I hope you really enjoyed this episode. And if you did, please like it, share it, or leave us a review on your favourite platform. It helps us show more of this content to people just like you.